decade. So many communities have made this program a part of their faith formation and social justice work. C.B. Beale once said, "Seeking racial justice in the world begins with dismantling white supremacy in ourselves and our congregations," end quote. Beloved Conversations, an anti-racist program through the FOS Collaborative at Meadville Lombard Theological School, went virtual last fall, where over 12,000 individuals joined the first phase of learning, as Chris said, in a 3-part series. During this program, there are many pathways for engagement, where you will learn together in large gatherings, independently, and collaboratively. The first portion of this journey is called the within phase, where you are asked to look inside yourselves and do some personal exploration of race and your work for racial justice. The second part is considered the among phase. That'll begin later this year and focuses on the institutional systemic changes that are needed in our congregations. And the third and final piece is the beyond phase, which is the work done outside our congregations with our local communities. And I believe that begins next year in 2022. This program offers 2 caucuses which run alongside one another. In one, white participants are invited to the Unlearning or Liberation course, which is presented to us in a way where we can begin to free ourselves from all preconceived notions of what allyship is and how we interact in the world as white people, and what it means to be present and in right relationship with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Learning to see through the eyes of others, especially those who are in marginalized communities. The second group is called the Gathering Ourselves course, which is an invitation to all Black, Indigenous, and people of color to recognize the need to understand the impact of racism in your lives, particularly your spiritual lives. You reflect on various issues such as how and why Unitarian Universalist values matter to you, how race has molded your personal and public lives, and what a theology for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in a white-dominated society might look like. Each is an opportunity for us to dive deeply and repeatedly into an ongoing collective and collaborative experience. Every 2 weeks, the curators of this course will release 6 at-your-own-pace lessons full of meaningful offerings like art and poems, music, essays and readings, meditations, podcasts, and videos, all of which engage and challenge and invite our minds and our hearts to move toward racial justice and so much more. At the end of each lesson, you are given a list of discussion prompts and are invited to reflect with others in an assigned group they call learning pods. Each pod consists of 4 to 5 people, and these are opportunities for connection that take place over Zoom and are self-scheduled bi-weekly check-ins. At the beginning of the course, you are also invited to choose a non-attending friend into conversation with you. This will be known as your critical friend throughout your journey. The hope is, if utilized, it will provide participants with an opportunity for feedback and reflection with someone you feel comfortable and safe with, and someone who can be real and honest with you. Even with all of this, there are still even more ways to connect during this program, beyond self-reflection and small groups. There are 4 meaning-making sessions that happen, which are much larger meetings featuring guest speakers, fellow students, and the creators of the program. These gatherings are crafted for reflection, discussion, and a focused time for worship. There is substantial connection and spiritual development with folks from other congregations all throughout this program. Beloved Conversations Virtual offers us all the opportunity to heal the impact of racism in our lives, and it is an amazing justice-building program that is carefully developed and a collective experience which gives us the framework to acknowledge and honor the spiritual nature of anti-racism work and an understanding that it is essential to our personal and religious development. Beloved Conversations is a program which helps change lives, and it can transform congregations. So it's important to understand that this is not your typical schooling experience where one might believe their personal responsibility to allyship and anti-racism work would be to simply take a 101 class and be done. This is different. This is a step in a lifelong faith formation and ongoing journey of learning, sharing, and growth. And I hope you'll join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Next up is Django. I know from conversation that he has been, by this course and other learning and awareness activities he's done on his own, he's had quite a transformational experience. So I'll leave it to him to share that now.
Thank you, Reverend. It was quite an interesting course. Unfortunately, the pod group did not work out as well as expected, so I didn't get much from the pod. But let me give you a little background. I hope I don't ramble too much, but to understand where I am now, it's important to know where I was then. So as a young boy, I went to school in New York, public school. I would say liberal only in the sense that the courses were more liberal from what I have learned from children in Texas. So it was a more expansive coursework. But also, I lived at a time when in the textbooks, the white man's burden was very clearly emphasized over and over again. So I grew up with that thought that it was the white person's burden to spread civilization throughout the world and in the United States. At the same time, I lived in a predominantly Irish Catholic neighborhood and was told repeatedly at the age of 7, 8, 9 or so that I killed Christ, and was often the subject of a lot of prejudice, a lot of school fights, a lot of things thrown at me, and very seldom did I understand, well, I didn't understand why. I would ask my parents, and they really didn't explain very well why children were mean to me and wanted to fight me and hurt me. So I thought I was pretty much awake and had empathy for others. So that's where I came from. So moving forward, I did not have a lot of experience after I left New York with anyone of color. I moved to Port Aransas. I spent 20 years in Port Aransas, which is a homogenous community, all white people. There were 3 black people living there. I fortunately knew them, but that was it, and no Hispanic people living there at all. So my experiences with people of color were more relational when I was in Africa, where I knew people in Zimbabwe and Uganda and South Africa, and had a roommate in Mexico who was black. And so that was my experience. So moving forward into this course, I thought, well, I'm not a prejudiced person, and I have empathy and I'm awake. So I thought, well, what will I learn from this course? So I realized after the resources in the course that I was living under a very limited knowledge, and I was looking at things quite naively. So when the topic, what does racial justice look like? I had no idea of the extent of police profiling and the justice system not being justice for all. Even though I myself had run-ins with the police for having long hair and being a hippie when I was in my teens, late teens and early 20s. So even though I didn't have a great experience with the police, I had no idea. So it was easy for me to understand what Black Lives Matter meant. There was no confusion on my part. But it wasn't until I started looking at the resources, going over things that I had read in public school, but went right over my head, like the readings of James Baldwin, listening to interviews with James Baldwin, who said some 50 years ago the same things that are happening now, how for a Black person to be received in this country, they either have to conform to the white world or not exist. They cannot succeed if they aren't part of this white superiority and white supremacy that we experience every day, this white privilege that we have. So it was watching some of these films, one that Reverend Chris mentioned, the death of Malcolm X and Judas and the Black Messiah, and One Night in Miami, and even more recently, the U.S. versus Billie Holiday, that it became clear, my eyes began to open to this idea of what's been going on in this country for, well, since its foundation, since its very beginning. And although we like to think things have changed, reading all this material, I see that it was incremental and that very little has changed. And the words of James Baldwin just ring out so clearly that white people just do not understand what it is to be a Black person in this country on a daily basis, and that every day could be the end of your life for simply not doing a turn signal on your car. So let me continue. So this course lifted the filters from my eyes on how not only people of color are treated, but if they want to conform and live in this country, there is a white standard that they are asked to follow in speech, action, dress, attitude. And the system doesn't bend to the person of color. The person of color has to bend to the system. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to just exist in this country. So there was some white fragility, and guilt, which didn't resonate with me as much as white credulity did, strangely. For instance, one of my heroes is Neil deGrasse Tyson. In fact, I played hooky from a meeting once to go see him because I feel so strongly about his message and even how he raises his children. He when his children have questions, he and his wife don't give them answers. They ask them to use critical thinking to come up with their own answers and then go over those answers. So, and yet I found myself amazed that this man is an astronomer. I never heard of a Black astronomer. And that's on me. That's clearly on me that I would find that something incredulous. So, it's ingrained in me, whether I recognize it or now I recognize it, but at then I did not. So I've learned that good intentions do not supersede poor impacts on people of color. So I've realized that the entire system is operated on the premise of white superiority, and that I must remain vigilant as to not become complacent when I see it in action, and to stop it when I can, and to voice my concern when I can. So although my eyes are clear now, they're filled with tears often when I see it just continue in this country over and over again with no end in sight. So I didn't mean to ramble on, but that was what I got from the course. Thank you.
Thanks, Django. And last but not least, we have Eli Poor.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, yeah, this, like others have said, this course has been really valuable and transformational for sure. So I'd like to share just a little bit of my background too, and some of the things that I've learned and kind of gotten to explore. So I remember when I was a teenager, I remember coming across some genealogy documents that my grandfather had put together, and among these things was a will from like my many times great grandfather. Both my mom and dad were originally from South Carolina. And since I was young, I'd been navigating the messages that I'd received from my family about race, and this prejudice that had kind of been forged in the South, which is the land of slavery and the Klan. And in this will of my great grandfather's, there was a section bequeathing their slaves and all of their descendants as property to their heirs. And so at this time, I thought about my best friends from, I'd gone to a magnet elementary school that was born of like efforts in the 80s and 90s to mitigate the segregation that was still present in towns like mine. And my friends were Black and brown. So I thought about them and thought about, gosh, did my family members at one point own members of their families? And that just really made me squirm. And so throughout the time when I was a kid, like the elementary school that I went to was in this old, refurbished, what was originally the Black segregated high school in the Black part of town. And my friends were all Black and brown. And from a really young age, it was imparted to us that it was wrong to differentiate on the basis of race, right? We were supposed to be colorblind, with individual merits being worth more than skin color. And that's what Dr. King dreamed of, right? And so we had these kind of two seemingly opposite poles, right? This outright racism with the slurs and my grandparents locking their car doors when we went to a certain side of town, the slavery that they participated in and benefited from, and then me not seeing race and not judging. But those things are in fact products of the same system. So one of the things that I've had to wrestle with is this idea of color blindness and this racial invisibility being a product also of white supremacy. And born of the same racism that has poisoned my family's perceptions that I so railed against. And colorblindness is just a white fantasy that erases the reality of the experiences of Black people and people of color and doesn't acknowledge the fact that the experience of a white person and a Black person living in America are very, very different. And that's one of the things that I got to explore a little bit further. And it's something that, you know, I know that many of my millennial peers and other folks we have to come to terms with that. So the value of Beloved Conversations, just providing a space to examine that legacy of white supremacy, including that colorblindness that's built into our systems, our culture, our values, and to look at how I personally, as a white person, have benefited from these systems. And it's also a call to imagine how, with the support of our liberal faith, we might start to counter these systems and begin to actually build that beloved community that Dr. King spoke of. So basically all of our systems, all of our institutions, our culture, our norms, including those that exist within our community, within our households, our workplaces, our congregation, they're all mired in white supremacy. They were built by and for the benefit of white people. Hierarchies, values, concepts of professionalism, our social customs, all of those things are all mired in white supremacy. Hierarchical leadership is another thing that came out of this course that I thought was really interesting. Just the standards of professionalism, just, you know, exploring basically that all of our norms are white norms, our values are white values, our baseline, the standard that we compare everything to is always based on white norms. So these spaces in which white people and people of color can safely engage with this legacy, like Beloved Conversations, are definitely invaluable tools, but spaces that look at this concept through the lens of our liberal faith can really be a revolutionary thing, I think. And these legacies only change when we have the courage to examine our beliefs and values and systems and norms, and to hold each other accountable in our growth, and where we can have those courageous conversations and understand that growth is uncomfortable for us. And so that's what's been really valuable. And I think that through programs like this and ultimately in partnership and in conversation with each other and through intentionally decentering white identity and experiences and voices, that's, you know, kind of the only hope that we have of countering that legacy and really building a world in which Black lives do matter. And we've all seen the urgency of this work too. It's very, very real. And so, yeah, I'm really, really grateful to have been participated in this, and it's ongoing work. It's ongoing work for all of us. It doesn't stop with the end of the course. It's something that we all have to do, work that we have to do individually and in partnership with each other. But yeah, I'm really grateful to have been able to participate in that. And yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Eli, and thanks to everyone who has shared their experiences today. I remember last week I talked about beginner's mind, and I think what the Beloved Conversations does, I took it as well. I think what it does is it really highly encourages those of us who are white to approach race and human relations as if we were a beginner, because there is so much unlearning we have to do. And being vulnerable and being able to accept, like, oh my goodness, what I was taught was wrong and that I have not always behaved in the ideal way, can be a very jarring yet very humbling but important experience to go through. I've been in a number of situations where I've been called out on things I've said and done that have not been ideal, and I've always, well, you know, part of me is reacting like in horror and shame. I've always tried to just recognize those moments as what they are, which is just learning opportunities. And I've tried to make the most of them. I know when I was in seminary, and my seminary is actually the folks at my seminary created this course, but they would always say as we were learning about Unitarian Universalism, you know, their goal, or to be preparing us to be ministers, their goal wasn't to just download a bunch of knowledge into our heads. They always talked about changing our way of being and doing, evolving in the way of being and doing. And I think that was very much part of the philosophy of this course. It's not just about gaining knowledge. It's really about kind of breaking you open so you can be receptive to new ways of being and new ways of doing that you might not have ever experienced before. So again, I would like to thank all of our speakers. It was terrific hearing from all of you. And now it is the time of the service when we take our offering.